Hello and welcome to today's presentation on access control within a domain. My name is Saeed and I will be conducting this lecture. User access control definition and importance. So, user access control involves controlling and regulating users' access to a computer system. Now this involves defining user permissions, authentication mechanisms, and ensuring that the users have appropriate level of access to resources. This process is very important as it maintains the security of the system by preventing unauthorized access and ensuring that the users only have access to the necessary permissions for their roles or the task that their role requires. There are four types of access controls: discretionary access control, mandatory access control, role-based access control, and attribute-based access control. Now, discretionary access control is an access control model where data owners have full authority to determine who has access to what file or data. Now, these are typically assigned by the owner, allowing them to control and manage who can access their resources. Now, this is typically found within, for example, sharing with friends and sharing with family. So, for example, you may have a Google Doc or Word document that you might want to have your parents look at because, hey, this is my CV. I want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. So you may want to allow them to have view-only access. So why would you do this? So it's up to your discretion. So that's why, because you don't want them to edit that CV and you only want yourself to have access to that. Mandatory access control is a strict access control strategy that employs classification levels to regulate access to sensitive information or it can be based on clearance levels of the users. So this is very important within certain organizations like the government. So company house might want to only have people accessing certain things. So that could be simply just due to the fact that, hey, this is corporate information, and if it leaks out, it can potentially be a major data breach. Or for example, in the military, where you only want certain people to have access to the tank blueprints because you don't want other countries to have access to that. No. You don't want that. Role-based access control. Now this is the method of regulating access to computer resources based on the role of individuals within an organization. Now RBAC allows you to assign it to the role, and then you then assign that role to someone within the organization. So for example, someone who is a lecturer who's teaching cybersecurity would not need access to, say, psychology information, the psychology resources. They don't need access to that because that's outside of the scope of their role. So that's an example of role-based access control. You don't want someone who is in a retail position whose literal job is to serve customers on the till to have access to HR information because that's outside of the scope of their role. Now, attribute-based access control. Now, this is a very important one. This regulates access to computer resources based on a set of attributes. This could be the job title, department, data sensitivity, file type, or environment attributes like time of access or location. Very important things, because if you're a big company like, say, Google, IBM, Microsoft, Nokia, now these companies will have multiple branches across the globe. Now, this is a very important thing, this environment-based attribute, because you don't want someone, say, from the US to access data and files from the UK or Japan, because that's outside of its data sovereignty, because every country has its own laws around data. For example, with China, they want access to everything, whereas within the US and the UK, certain companies may not want to share certain things with the government because, hey, that's sensitive classified information, that might be industry trade secrets, so they don't want someone to have access to that. So you would want the UK people to have access to the UK stuff, the US people to have access to the US stuff, and the Chinese people to have access to the Chinese stuff within the organization. Now, the UK, for example, with HMRC, the way they conduct their information and the way they process information is different to, say, the IRS in the US. So that's an example. Another example, it would be within a help desk environment. Now, because they can have access to certain things within the system, and that person may be on holiday, for example, you don't want them to be able to access the company resources, which is only accessible between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. For example, you don't want those outside those hours. So a time of access is implemented within operation hours. Now, how are these typically found? How are these access controls typically found within businesses? Now, role-based access control, attribute-based access control, and discretionary access control are the common ones which you find within businesses. Now, discretionary access control is where small businesses may be using. A coffee shop might want only to share, say, flyers with someone within the company who owns a printer. So that's a simple, hey, I'm sharing Sharon this picture of a cat having a coffee, and I'm not going to share it to Sam because Sam doesn't have a printer. That's my discretion. I just chose these people because of certain reasons. Mandatory access control. Now, this is typically found within governments because top secret and confidential information. Militaries as well because security clearance. Like I said, you don't want someone to have access to a tank. You don't want someone to have access to the blueprint of a tank. So mandatory access controls will be implemented for that reason. Now, role-based access controls you could typically find within, say, a hospital. Now, doctors and nurses will have access to patient records. You may want someone from the administration team to have access to the database because if something goes wrong, then they can amend and update the database and make sure that the database security and integrity is up to date. Companies will also make sure that role-based access controls are implemented when it comes to IT infrastructure. Because, hey, you don't want someone who doesn't know anything about IT to have access to IT infrastructure because they might mess it up. Now, attribute-based access controls can be found on software. So HR will have access to, say, the payroll system, and someone on the retail end will have access to the retail software. Software developers with attributes like job title, department, and security clearance will have access to tools which they will use. So a software developer will have access to, say, Visual Studio Code, whereas someone whose job is to clean will have that access. They'll have access to the rooms, which is the attribute of the job title. Now, how is access control within Active Directory applied? Now, this is a very important one. This is where the concept of organization units come in. So, organization units are container objects in Active Directory domain services. They're used to organize users, groups, computers, and other organization units. Yes, you can utilize an OU to hold an OU. This is because of OU's hierarchical structure, meaning that you can have an OU for a branch, and within that could be with departments within that branch. So, for example, Newport branch, and then within that you have an OU for the retail, finance, and so on and so forth. Now, how are access controls in Active Directory applied? So this is done through access control lists, which are used to define and enforce the permissions on objects. So these access control lists are attached to objects such as files, folders, and organization units. Each access control list contains access control entries. Now, these specify which users and groups have access to what object. Permissions can include actions like reading, writing, modifying, and deleting the object. So, For example, the data within a database. You might want someone to have read-only access if, for example, the job requires it. You may not want someone who is in charge of finance to modify the database, because why would they do that? Their only job is to read what sales are coming in and out. They don't need to delete any sale information because it's not needed. Administrators can manage these access control lists to control access to resources within the Active Directory environment, meaning that administrators should only have access. Administrators should have read, write, and the modification ability and deleting ability. So that will be applied to their OU. So you have an OU for administrator, an OU for finance. So the OU for finance will have access to only reading, whereas the OU for administrator will have the ability to read, write, modify, and delete the objects. The reason for this is because of least privilege. Only grant necessary access is a layered defense that utilizes multiple security measures, because these security measures are then continuously monitored and regularly checked for threats. And you can harden your Active Directory by hardening domain controllers, keeping them updated, restricting network access, managing group policies, and regularly reviewing your group policy objects. Monitoring and auditing is very important within the Active Directory, as you want to track the logs, so which administrator has edited the database, which administrator has deleted an entry in the database, and these logs could be sent over to a security information event management system. So Splunk is an example of this. Splunk allows you to import data logs from the PC and other software to make sure that, hey, someone on the Linux server has decided to modify the database. Someone within the Active Directory has decided to give access to Visual Studio to this department. So that's what a security information event management system would present. It will be a dashboard for all these logs in one place. Network access logs, Active Directory logs, and others. Door access logs, for example, within a university would be an example of that, being in a security information event management system. Basic security hygiene is also very important, keeping your software up to date because they might patch out vulnerabilities, regularly performing backups because you never know if your hard drive might corrupt, training staff to recognize if an email is a phishing attempt, control who has the highest level of access because you don't want someone who is outside of a certain role to have such high level of access to the entire system, strengthening the security of your core AD system. In other words, making sure that only certain people can have access to things, making sure that your Active Directory is up to date, the patches are applied, and so on and so forth. Keeping a constant watch of suspicious activity, so monitoring your security information event management system to check if anyone has decided to randomly put up a device that is not owned by the organization on the network, making sure that, hey, Samantha, who's working in finance, who's on holiday in Spain, is for some reason now accessing our systems in the US. So that would be an example of it's a bit suspicious activity and something you might be getting flags in your security information event management system. So that's the end of today's presentation, and I hope that you guys find this informative, and I hope you guys also tune in for the next one. See you guys.